The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Hi there and welcome to Pharma's Oncology Health Economics webinar. I'm Aidan Brain, Head of Oncology at Pharma. I'm just going to wait a couple of moments whilst everybody enters the room for the webinar. So thank you for joining us today. Hello there. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome to the Pharma Oncology Health Economics webinar. I'm delighted that you could all join us today. In an apt reflection of the importance of the topic today, we've got over 300 people registered. Many director and VP level attendees of Big Pharma and more are actually logging in as we speak right now. I'm Aidan Brain, Head of Oncology at Pharma, and I'm pleased to be joined here today by three individuals who have been getting an awful lot of press recently for their expertise in the area of health economics. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. However, it's probably best that I just mention that payers and physicians alike, as well as pharma, have found their work extremely beneficial, and they're a great example of a new type of model, attitude, and solution that can make healthcare economics sustainable, yet also very simple at the same time. Before we get going, I've actually got some questions for the audience. So take a look at your screen, and you will see the first question now. Okay, so we'll just wait for the results of that question to come in. Okay, so the results are coming in now. Okay, so the poll will be closed in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So the question I asked was, do you find that international reference pricing has a positive or negative effect on reimbursement for your oncology drugs? Now, 27% of those who voted said that it had a positive effect on their oncology pipelines, whereas 73% said it had a negative effect. Now, this is interesting, and this is something that is a mainstay of the research that Pharma carries out into health economics. Reference pricing, particularly in the European landscape, does often tend to be viewed as a headache by many within pharma. However, at the same time, there are many who find that reference pricing is something that they can, in fact, take advantage of. So it's interesting to see such an extreme disparity between the results there. Okay, so the next question will be coming up just now. So if you all look at your screens, you will see question number 2. So I'll just wait for everybody to answer this. Okay, the poll will be closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great, let's look at the results here. So I asked, do you expect value-based pricing to become the norm rather than the exception in the future of European oncology? Now, we've gotten a very clear result here. 56% of the attendees agree that value-based pricing is expected to become the norm rather than the exception in the future of health economics in Europe. And 35% actually agree strongly. So that is 89% of attendees, which is extremely interesting. Value-based pricing is something, again, that is something of a watchword in the European health economic landscape, particularly in the United Kingdom. However, as many other governmental bodies look towards the United Kingdom's National Institute of Clinical Excellence, this style of health economics is sure to become extremely prevalent in the future. Okay, so I'm now going to ask the third question. Okay, and I'm going to send that right now. Okay, I'm now going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, now we have some very interesting results here. 52% of everybody asked who in their company should be taking the lead with payer engagement chose market access, which is obviously the traditional view. However, it is interesting that there were attendees who believed that at least one of the other departments should also have a role. So medical affairs is the lowest role, but pricing and reimbursement was actually the second highest after market access. Now this is an interesting question that I wanted to ask because at a recent IFA payer panel, Omar Ali of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence mentioned that one of the main issues with payer engagement for many pharmaceutical companies in Europe was their lack of a cross-functional team used within payer engagement. So this is something that the speakers today will discuss more on, payer engagement. However, I just thought it would be interesting to know these results. Okay, so that's the end of my questions for now, but what I really want is for you guys to be asking the questions from here on out. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a box where you can just type your query. That's the chat box. I hope that each person currently listening will send in at least one question during the next few minutes as we talk about the issue of oncology health economics in Europe. We might not be able to answer every single question that is asked. However, we will do our very best to answer the vast majority of them. Just so everybody knows, a recording will be available and sent out to you after the event, so don't worry about that. Now I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. So first of all, Olivier, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Olivier again. I'm a scientific director in Research Unit at the University of Liège in Belgium, a research unit specifically dedicated to the economic and financial evaluation of medical innovation. Thank you. Aidan, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, everybody can see your screen, Olivier.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that's better. So oncology economics. So thank you, Aidan, from i4 Pharma to give me the opportunity to talk about oncology economics. It's, as you can imagine, a relatively vast topic, and I'm only given 8 minutes to go through that topic, and so I would like to share with you my key vision on this important aspect of giving access to innovative drugs for oncology patients. Talking about economics, of course, we all think and we all apply relatively immediately now. It's basically written in a brain, the very famous incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, which basically in the field of oncology and notably in a kind of high-profile medical products does not prove really useful, as the incremental cost per additional quality gain is clearly out of range as compared to the conventional and accepted threshold by HTA bodies. In addition to that, we also need to acknowledge that basically this ratio is computed mostly from ex-ante evidence, from indirect evidence, from literature data, proxy data, through extrapolation in a model and so on, which by sense is okay, but we also clearly need to take that for what it is exactly, an ex-ante computation of a relatively arbitrary threshold that does not necessarily document how the budget will be spent and how good the population, the target population, will clearly benefit from the new product being launched. So in contrast to that, and I think as probably a new approach, maybe it's better, I would say, to start from the beginning. So this is a relatively simplistic and illustrative illustration of clinical trial data. Let's assume it's a completely, it's an example. It's a clinical trial data, so with as survival as the main outcome of interest of the trial. On one side, you have the control group. We assume 400 patients being treated with the standard of care or whatever is the control product, versus the 400 patients being treated by the new product. You have the mean average survival time for each group, and you see that, for instance, it is true the treated group has shown kind of improved survival outcome, as demonstrated by the average survival time. Let's say that this is statistically significant and so on, and the value proposition of the product in front of the payers will be mostly built around this outcome. But what does matter really, it's what is called in financial terms the cone of uncertainty, that, to my opinion, is receiving very, very, very less of attention from health economists at this stage. So whatever you say, whatever you extrapolate, whatever you model through indirect evidence, complex modeling and so on, what does really matter at the end in financial terms is how the uncertainty will evolve. Yes, you have observed from your trials in the treated population of 400 patients a certain average survival. Here in the example is 14 months. But you have to acknowledge that it's a very, very small group of patients, control patients, pre-selected patients that are not necessarily representative of the target populations to whom the product will be given in real life. And in contrast, on the other side of the slide, on the right-hand side, you have another example here. It's about, we have the result for 4,219 patients, real-life patients, who were given the products, and you see the distribution of outcome in terms of survival time since product initiation, treatment with the product initiation. So this is what it clearly means, and clearly, if I could say, worry the payers, is this distribution of outcome. And health economics, as it is traditionally conducted, as it is traditionally presented, does not address that. Address what? On the second slide following that, you have the proportion of real-life patients who simply did not achieve the standard of care survival, assumed to be, for instance, in this example, the same as the one observed in the trial. So if you remember the trial and the control group, we were having an average survival of 11.7 months. In this situation, in this example, yes, 1,700 patients did not achieve this standard of care survival of 11 months. And in average, taking even the average of the population who has been giving the products, we have an average survival of 13.3 months, which is even less than the average observed in the clinical trials. So that's the uncertainty, that this is what does really matter to the payers, because this uncertainty will translate into a financial risk. So risk is another concept very distinct from uncertainty. Certainty, we don't really know where we are going, so we will be given a product, we don't really know what we will observe in real life practice. And financial risk, but someone will have to pay for the realization, the adverse realization of a certainty. And what is the adverse realization of a certainty? It's having patients who do not achieve the expected value, the value proposition of the product. So let's say, to be abstract here, we were targeting 14 months absolute survival, and almost 25 or 30% of them did not even achieve 11 months of 13 months of survival. And paying for those patients who did not even achieve the anticipated value is the financial risk. The payer is paying for disappointing outcome, and this is what he wants basically to mitigate through whatever strategy as a manufacturer you will be able to present the payer with. Could be risk sharing, could be coverage with evidence development, could be bringing some new form of diagnostic algorithm, guidelines, helping clinicians, helping payers to identify patients with the highest likelihood of response. So the purpose of the future of health economics will be to manage uncertainty, but the real uncertainty does really matter to payers dynamically throughout the product adoption in the real life setting. So we are not anymore talking about uncertainty in the parameters in health utility or about the structure of a Markov model. No, we are here talking about the uncertainty, what is going to happen to the patient being given the product in the real life setting. This real life setting will generate, of course, a certain evidence, the real life evidence, which is by definition automatically a function of two parameters, two things: the number of real life patients being given therapy, that's the product adoption, and the calendar time since launch. So here we should also think differently of applying modeling, applying statistical analysis that use duration time, like Markov model, like survival curve. It's duration time. You have initiation of therapy, and we follow patient as time goes by, but on a duration basis. Here it's calendar time. We need to we need to understand, to set where the product starts to launch, and try to understand how much information we are collecting as compared to the entire population who will be given the product, and see when sufficient evidence is gathered in the real life setting to take appropriate action, and define the value-based price, because the price will be then set on the real value achieved by the products in a real life setting. So all these kind of methods, like value of information, which is already used by health economics, but not, if I could say, the appropriate setting, so ex ante to determine what type of utility needs to be collected and so on. Those methods should also be used, and will be, to my opinion, better used in the real life setting. So gathering information, early information, as the product is available in the real life setting, and based on value of information, analysis, determine when there is sufficient evidence collected in this real life setting to take appropriate decision. And in the meantime, mitigating the payer exposure to financial risk with managed entry agreement as the umbrella term for risk sharing, coverage with evidence development. And of course, if in the meantime the industry is able to identify, to develop, to validate some algorithm diagnostics criteria to select the patients, that will be even better. So as a conclusion, yes, what does really matter on oncology, probably more in oncology, in other field, even more in oncology as compared to other field, is to manage uncertainty, but dynamically once the product is launched. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olivier. So you just heard from Olivier FGen, Associate Professor of Health Economics at the University of Liège, and also co-author of The Future of Health Economics. Olivier co-authored his book with Ulf Sturginus, who will now be speaking. So I'm going to pass over to Ulf to introduce himself.
And pricing with endocyte in Europe. Maybe before I start my presentation, and thanks Olivier, I think that's a perfect introduction from theory to practice. Just 2 words on our company. Endocyte is a small biopharmaceutical company based in West Lafayette, Indiana. We have an office in Switzerland. And we are a leader in the small molecule drug conjugate technology, have a port pipeline in those SMDC, as we call them, therapeutics, but also with component diagnostics. Our main product at the moment is developed in partnership with Merck, sort of out-licensed the product. We are responsible for the component diagnostics. Looking at the topic that we were discussing today, I just need to put this on full screen here, I think. Yeah. You know, we can obviously talk. You know, there are a lot of topics when we look at the sort of the talking points that i4Pharma has put forward, and I think Olivier has touched on a couple of them. Interestingly, before I come, I also wanted to say I found it was quite surprising to me to see the result of the poll that we did, because, you know, a large percentage of people said reference pricing is positive. At the same time, 89% or something expect value-based pricing to be, you know, coming over Europe. So the issue there is that actually both of them have to be somehow mutually exclusive. You know, you can't have value-based pricing if at the same time you have reference pricing. But maybe we'll discuss about this later. But what I wanted to do is to follow on Olivier's talk and really talk about the hot topic in oncology, which is sort of targeted therapy. Some people call it personalized medicine, others call it stratified. Obviously, there are important differences, but for the sake of this talk, let's use just all of the terms, but knowing that there are obviously differences. If you look at this slide that I've put up now, this is actually the main issue in oncology, and obviously for other treatments as well, but specifically to cancer. That is the issue of non-responders and the average response to drug treatment. And if you look at this a little further on the next slide, and this data is a little older, from 2006, but I think it still makes the point along the oncology products, and here the sort of the major blockbusters that we all know who are on this field. You can see that even apart from, you know, products like Gilead, obviously an exceptional product in its class, or in the entire field of oncology, there's a large proportion of patients, although treated, are not benefiting from the drug. And depicted in the slide that we're seeing now, and I think this is data from the US, but you know, this obviously reflects the situation across the globe. It's the issue that people perceive the cost versus benefit gap. Simply, you know, when we look at the 1970s to 2010, we had sort of every 10 years sort of a major jump in prices. You know, with that, obviously, there came also innovation, and, you know, sometimes significant innovation, but sometimes only sort of incremental innovation. But, you know, the critics is justified in certain areas that sort of the cost has dramatically risen, yet the benefit is sort of lagging behind, and this creates the tension on payers. This is, you know, duplicated by the European financial crisis and actually all the exchange rate movements we had starting in 2011, which actually brought a lot of, you know, movement into reference pricing. This is a very negative effect. Again, another interesting fact for me that many people found this reference pricing actually so positive. But you know, coming back to this, so customers demand value. You know, the traditional pharma model, and a lot has been talked and written about it. You know, a lot of benefit, or some benefit to all, but not very specific, and Olivier has put this nicely into a slide, not very specific on, you know, what's the uncertainty around outcomes. Now, this is where stratified medicine, and this is the term we've used here, stratified medicine comes in. You know, more benefit to many and less risk to many. In other words, you know, the patient population decreases because we're sort of focusing in niching in on those people likely to respond. Cost may go up or down. This really depends on price setting and dynamics within the treatment approach. And obviously, complexity is going up as well, because treatment and the diagnostic is a different ballgame in terms of market access and pricing than just a drug on its own. But on the positive side, value proposition and pricing have their upside. Usually access is easier, or at least is more focused, and with that, a market penetration can be easily achieved into a very clearly defined target group. At the same time, we have payers who obviously, everyone likes personalized medicine. Everyone says, if you have something that's really targeted and you can eliminate patients that are not likely to respond, it's positive. But at the same time, it's also being used, of course, as another way of cost management in a positive sense. Moving on to the next slide, which is just depicting. We've seen obviously a lot of development in this area, especially the molecular testing platforms, recent launches with ALK tests in non-small cell lung cancer, BRAF tests for melanoma, etc. So there's a lot of companion diagnostics coming along the way, following this concept of selecting patients more likely to respond to their therapy than in the old traditional model of oncology. The value proposition that comes along with it, of course, is, and I don't think we need to spend so much time on it, it's more straightforward, of course. The responder selection, we talked about it already, but also a risk stratification, which translates, in better dose and duration, and of course, management of toxicities and quality of life from a clinical perspective. Economic perspective, I think it's very logic, of course. Potential cost savings by not treating patients that would most likely not respond or benefit from the treatment, hence potential to reduce budget, again, depending on the relative prices in the respective market, and of course the performance of the product. But it is obviously a way, and I think Olivier had it on a slide, that it's one of the elements in the future to guarantee, or at least to have a higher likelihood of better clinical outcomes in combining this with a more cost-effective use of healthcare resources, and by that obviously sort of closing a little more the gap that has come up between cost and perceived and actually observed benefit of innovative treatments in the field. Now, this is the theory, and the practice, however, is this. And here it depends a little bit on what business model is being perceived. Is a pharmaceutical company also an integrated, or has an integrated diagnostic part, or the partnerships between companies, or they're just single diagnostic companies, and then another sort of treatment that fits the diagnostic is being developed. But the issue with market access in this area is that both sort of diagnostics as well as pharmaceutics are evaluated by different decision makers, even within the same health authority. We have the situation that a lot of payers are not very familiar with the novel companion diagnostic, and so it's mostly often reduced to sort of cost and tariff-based reimbursement levels. It's compared sometimes to older radiologic agents, or it's sort of lists of tariffs that have been established years ago without actually looking at clinical utility or cost effectiveness. So most of the time, companion diagnostics face the issue that you either have to somehow increase existing budgets, or sort of have your procedure covered in a DRG, and we all know how difficult it is to either increase those DRGs or even create new items in certain reimbursement lists. So there's a large disconnection here between the talk of value-based pricing, the talk of assessing value, and actually the practice of reimbursement for those type of things. There are clearly inconsistent processes, I was going to say, for value assessment across Europe. Oncologists are excited, as I said before, but payers and reimbursement situation is not keeping up with it. And this slide just depicts, on a very broad sort of scale, a little bit what I was just going to say about the different levels of evaluation of companion diagnostics, right? So most of the time with pharmaceuticals, we're used to have assessment at the national level. Companion diagnostics are mostly on local levels or sort of Twitters or different sort of, merge situations, either a little bit national but then local. So it's confusing, and it is very difficult, obviously, to extract the value in a system that is rather bureaucratic and static in its approach to look at these things. Now, the issue really is, how do you capture the value of the product, or specifically here from my perspective from a companion diagnostic perspective, how do you capture the value of the test? And as we said before, most of the time, people would drive you to cost tariff-based pricing, resulting in relatively low prices, and that obviously, creates really difficult incentives for those companies active in R&D in this area, because you have to think about how do you realize the value of your investment. And if you look at some of the obviously very known examples like the HER2 test, for instance, or KRAS in colorectal cancer, etc., that a lot of pharmaceutical companies actually have been involved and set somehow a negative precedent in various markets by giving the test for free, the KRAS test. And while this was maybe good for getting the product or the drug relatively quickly into the market, at the same time it's created a dilemma for other newcomers in this industry. So there's a lot of room for improvement, obviously, again, depending on which business model is being brought forward. But I put up one example here, the last one, and I put Oncotype DX from Genomic Health, just to take this as an example, has achieved value-based pricing by the probably sort of the definitions that are out there at the moment, with a large investment in clinical health economics and obviously also observational studies. And in Europe, the uptake is still relatively low, although even the cost effectiveness has been proven and cost savings have been demonstrated in larger populations. So it's a very slowly moving field. So as Olivier said, I think the idea on the future of health economics and oncology is to reduce or to target treatment to those that are likely to benefit, by at the same time, combining this with a way of quickly assessing who these patients are with whatever companion diagnostic test, or in the future, whatever technology may evolve. But that requires involvement on payer side to look at this holistically and to really drive the concept of value-based pricing. It's discussed away from the cost per quality, but also to more flexible assessment, be it different forms of pricing, or be it coverage with evidence development, because no one has the 2 years to wait until another D or G is being expanded or tariff is being created to include the technology. So I think with that, I hope that's some food for discussion and question, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Ulf. That was an extremely interesting talk there. And as mentioned, Ulf and Olivier, our first presenter, collaborated on the future of health economics. I'm now going to pass over to Ed Schoenveld, who also contributed to the book and who has his own book, The Price of Global Health. Ed is also Principal of Market Access and Pricing at Zedis Associates. So I will pass over to him now. We also have quite a lot of good questions coming through so far, so keep them coming, guys. Towards the end, we will discuss these between the audience and the panelists. Thank you. So I'm now going to pass over to Ed.
Thank you, Ivan. I hope everybody can hear me. Often Olivier talked a lot about capturing value, and in that context, particularly Olivier talked about the use of health economics and health outcomes data in that context, and overextended that also with respect to the diagnostics. I'd like to move the discussion a little bit and say, well, it's all nice what we think about how we demonstrate our value. But let's look at what the actual decision makers are doing so that we are making sure that we are aiming the evidence that we're developing at the actual decision-making processes. And particularly, and I'm focused on oncology, of course, because that's the topic of this discussion, what it means, some of the latest trends and what we can learn from that. And that obviously all in only a couple of minutes. So first of all, as they say in Asia, may you live in interesting times. Well, maybe we are. All over the world, there is a lot of attention to pricing. You see on the left side in the slide two issues raised from the US side. There was a Blood article criticizing prices and price increases for CML drugs. There was a lot of noise around Sanofi price for Zartrat that ultimately they had after Sloan Kettering rejected reimbursement. Of course, we have a lot of discussion about value-based pricing, the future of the cancer drug fund, patient access schemes in that sense. Of course, AMNOG has created a lot of noise. And then, outside Europe, obviously, but there's also, particularly in oncology, a big risk with respect to compulsory licensing taking place, particularly in India. So these are some of the things that keep us busy. So let's take a step back in a broader sense, and let's say when we're looking across the world, what are some of the trends? And the framework that I like to do to that is with the basic kind of payer segmentation. What are some of the main management philosophies that payers are using across the world? Not that every payer fits perfectly in the box, and there certainly are, cases of orange, if you will, between yellow and red here, but that's not the point. These are the principles that we need to be ready for and that we need to study. So just generally speaking, we have the blue box, which is the US, which is really managing on basis of addressing what insurance companies are demanding and what they're willing to do with respect to placement of formulary, restrictions, etc. We have a big block of therapeutic referencing markets, and those, of course, are big in Europe and Japan, where a payer is looking at what is a comparator that's reasonable, what evidence do I have versus that comparator, and so what am I prepared to pay as a premium over that comparator or a discount. We have the health economics-driven systems, of course, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden are the most known ones, which are basically cost effectiveness is the prime criterion for reimbursement. And then we have a big group of markets that still, to a large extent, is cash pay because most of the population, certainly for expensive oncology and hematology drugs, cannot afford that. So for all practical purposes, many of those, although they have some insurance, many patients are going from a cash out-of-pocket perspective. So what do we see globally? We see a lot of economic struggles that is continuing. We see blockbuster patent expirations, and we see the biosimilars, of course, coming up, which may affect this group very much as well. But then when we're looking at some of these segments, and I want to talk about those a little bit more in detail, we have the therapeutic referencing block, where we see alignment on benefits, and I'll explain it a little bit. We certainly see a lot of strictness in evidence development developing, and more of a focus on specific patients. Actually, let me go straight there, and I'll get back to this slide. So we see that with the introduction of AMNOG, there's clearly a trend towards, being more strict and being more systematic around assigning a benefit versus a comparator. Of course, AMNOG, and IQWiC executing that has been very carefully crafting this process with a lot of criticism as well. We know we had the system, such a system in a lot of robustness in France already with the ASMR, and to a less extent in Italy and Spain, and of course in Japan. What we see though is that, and what we expected in the EU, there's been a lot of energy around UNETA aligning at least the health technology assessment kind of standards. We see a trend that there's a lot of energy in Europe to align on the standards with respect to benefits assessment as well. Actually, the draft version of the ITR, a new classification system in France, it may never come in existence, but it looked very much like the one that AMNOG has been introducing. Another trend that we see is clearly an increasing demand for head-to-head data. not a lot of tolerance anymore for placebo-controlled trials, and of course in oncology this has always been harder, and in some cases a placebo-controlled trial is justified when there's no other treatment. But in France it's virtually law now that you cannot, let me put it this way, you better have a good reason if you don't have a trial. Also the standard of care in the comparator arms are very important to be realistic from that perspective. And in Germany, we've seen, of course, in many cases, compounds have been having a not a benefit assessment because of the lack of this kind of data. Same thing with respect to the claims. Depends a little bit on the indication, but progression-free survival, response rates are clearly inferior to overall survival for payers, and becoming harsher and harsher on demanding that kind of data, although it's a little bit different by cancer type, I would say. The French system has now introduced the medical economic review. It's going to be not going to be like NICE, but it's certainly going to be an additional factor that's going to play a role, particularly for the higher cost drug, where this kind of review is going to be mandatory. And again, it will play next to the ASMR rating, but it will have some influence clearly, particularly for the higher cost drugs. And then I think that's important to consider as well, is that in these markets, payers are hesitant to say no to any specific drug with respect to reimbursement, but they are increasingly careful about making sure that the selection of the patients for which the treatment is authorized is very carefully done. So trying to restrict it to the populations where the evidence is very clear. And there's been a general trend with AMNOG in Germany now as well, and before that in France, where that selection is becoming increasingly a point of contention. That's likely to continue, particularly for these high-cost drugs. So let's move on to the famous value-based pricing aspect. So of course there's still a lot of noise in UK around the introduction of value-based pricing. It's supposed to be introduced in a couple of months, and we're still not sure where it stands. The Cancer Drug Fund, which of course was kind of addressing a less than perfect system, it has already been announced that it's going to be extended. But let's make clear what value-based pricing really does, because the phrase is very misleading. Let me tell you something. Unless if you are in the generics business, you were doing value-based pricing. So just by the phrase itself, we are pricing at value. Only how do you establish that value, and how do you handle it with respect to controlling pricing and reimbursement? That's where the big difference is. So value-based pricing in the UK is really value-based price control. It's introducing a price control system where if the company is not willing to price it at what the NHS through NICE is establishing as a reasonable price, then if you will, they'll probably not be able to launch. Also, and that of course is important, particularly for anti-cancer drugs, the ISA cut-offs will include some other factors. So instead of the 20 to 30,000 pounds, it will be affected by the disease burden, societal benefits, and that is expected to benefit oncology or less disadvantage oncology less than other therapy areas. So there might be some good news there for oncology, or at least less bad news. But we really don't know yet where this is going at this stage. So getting back to my larger picture, so particularly for Europe, of course, the value-based pricing and therapeutic referencing trends are controlling the landscape. I just wanted to give a few words about the US and the emerging markets because there are important things happening there as well. Of course, rising cost of healthcare is a big issue in the US for the government, for employers, as well as for patients, and particularly in oncology. Co-insurance rates are fairly high. Like median for Part D is 33%. For Part B, it's 20%. So it is, particularly for high-cost drugs, it is a lot of money. Plan coverage may become leaner, particularly these new exchanges that are coming into effect. They're probably not going to be very rich programs, so there's going to be a lot of cost sharing that may affect drug choice as well. A lot of focus on effectiveness, competitive effectiveness, accountable care organizations, and that is really an important trend to follow, although we're not sure yet where it's going to go. For oncology, maybe the ACOs are going to be a little bit less of an impact because cost is not the main driver that people are thinking of, and there's still a lot of concerns about being too critical for cancer drugs. But then the CMS article and just the whole noise around KOLs supporting a compound, being perceived maybe of supporting a company that may be jacking prices, also the provider perspective on the cost of drugs. Do they get sufficiently reimbursed? These things we really need to keep a close eye on in the US with respect to making sure that we address the cost sensitivity of all players, not just the payers, the managed care payers. To work on the emerging market, there are a lot of coverage opportunities, but they come with risk of price controls. We know that. So before you think too much about that's the next really growth opportunity. Yes, there is a growth opportunity, but there are limited budgets, and countries will engage into some control systems when they are bearing more of the cost of themselves. Big question mark around compulsory licensing. Is there going to be a phase 2? Hopefully nobody will follow India, but it's a very scary process, particularly since our reputation still as an industry is so poor, which puts us at a tremendous risk. I think for the time being, there are probably more private cash opportunities than there are coverage opportunities for the more expensive branded anti-cancer drug, but we need to monitor that closely. And then lastly, the social responsibilities through the Access to Medicines Index. It's not one that should drive our strategies exclusively, but that's something we need to keep an eye on as well. And some companies have gotten into trouble for. And that's really the end of my presentation. I'm open, obviously, to any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Ed. That was an extremely interesting talk there. So we've actually got an awful lot of questions that I'd like to put forward to Ed, Ilse, and Olivier. The first is from Shanida Nataraja at Axon Communications. Shanida has asked, which outcome endpoints do you consider relevant for modern oncology drugs in relation to value-based pricing? So I would like to direct that one to Ed.
Well, this is an interesting discussion. I mean, value-based pricing really is not changing so much. I'd say the calculation of the cost effectiveness itself, of course. So that part is going to stay the same. So I'd say the usual metrics. I think what's going to become very important in value-based pricing, and that's the real difference, is how do you bring those societal factors into the equation? So how can you make sure that beyond some of the clinical metrics, people who are maybe not an expert in the medical field can see the value that is really changing the life of a patient. I'd say not just a quality of life metric in terms of some kind of a scale, but one that more from a public health perspective is deemed to be important. And obviously for every payer system, not just value-based pricing, I think overall survival is becoming more and more important. But Ulf made the point, at launch, you have limited ability to show that kind of data. So the ability to close agreements and be reasonable on the expectation for the data, I think is going to continue to be extremely crucial in oncology.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer there, Ed, and thank you for your question, Shanida. So I have a question here from Sophie Hadlow of Gilead Sciences. Sophie has asked, should oncology be seen as different to other therapy areas when it comes to health economics? Being devil's advocate, is it really a special case? And that's also directed to Ed.
Oncology has always been a little bit different, certainly in the eyes of the pharma people in oncology. And it is different to some extent. I think certainly in the US, where the payers are putting mandates in place with respect to coverage. So, I mean, the government, states are putting mandates in place in 35 or so states. Having said that, even there, it has to be covered by the co-insurance rates and some of the restrictions payers can still place. I think it's less so in the future, though. You clearly see that in Europe, payers are have to get increasingly comfortable managing this. I mean, about 40% or so of the pipeline of drugs is in oncology. The market is becoming more crowded, and you see where there are closer substitutes. I'm thinking of renal cell carcinoma, for example. Payers are becoming more and more comfortable managing it where the differences are smaller. But they still don't want to trump oncologists. They want to make sure that they have the tools they need.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Ed. I now have a question from Jan Haybrook at MD Outlook. Jan has asked, do you think that market access aspects are a one-time issue for each product, market, or payer combination, or something that actually needs to be managed on a continuous and consistent basis? Now that one is for Ulf, but I'd like to actually get both of your comments, Ulf and Ed, on that. But that one was directed initially to Ulf.
Okay. Well, I guess the straightforward answer is yes, right? I mean, to me, market access is a dynamic process that that starts long before launch, and that can probably continues until patent expiry. So I think it's a constant adjustment of your portfolio, your strategy, and the environment you're in there. It has to be very cross-functional, of course, as we talked about it. And a lot of the discussions, when I saw your initial question, Aidan, I think a lot of it is semantics, right? Some companies have only one pricing guy, and some people have gigantic departments. So, what matters in the end of the day is, I think that that you're creating the data that justifies the value of your product, and if it can't be done for technical reason, and that answers maybe some of the questions before on PFS and OS or whatever is the most relevant endpoint. This depends very much on the disease and on your ability to reach these endpoints. But when you can't reach them at launch, you have to set up infrastructures and means in place to create this data later on, because in the end of the day, I guess if I was in the shoes of a payer at some point, I want to see that this product is going to do what you're set out, what you promoted it to be, right? So that per se makes it a very dynamic and consistent process over time.
Great, thank you for that, Ulf. I have another question for you here, Ulf, from Jill Sackman of Numeroff Associates. Now, Jill has asked, have any oncology drug approvals been contingent on having an accurate diagnostic test to identify the optimal patient population? So I think that the crucial point there is contingent. Would you be able to shine a light on that one, Ulf?
I think that depends on the label, and I believe there are many drugs that are being used according to label, which means a pre-defined diagnostic test has to qualify the patient as being positive towards the marker in order to be using the drug. So I think the answer is yes.
Brilliant. Thank you for that answer, Ulf. I now have a question for yourself, Ed. This is from Tim Saloni of mClone. Tim has said, when there is no benchmark or historical level of efficacy for a specific selected patient population, how is cone of uncertainty analysis performed by payers? Are the control arm outcomes used instead?
Well, I'm not maybe the right person to answer that question. Maybe Ulf can better, but let me give you my response. I think in any case, patient analyses, data analyses need to give a view and a picture that payers can act on, and for that they need to really clearly understand it. So sometimes we're coming with very complex scientific analyses, if you will, that create a lot of question marks for payers more than anything else. On the technical side, maybe Ulf can respond better.
I have to admit, I missed the last part of the question. I confess.
I'll ask that one again. So Tim asked, when there is no benchmark historical level of efficacy for a specific selected patient population, how is the cone of uncertainty analysis performed by payers? Are the control arm outcomes used instead?
I think I'll have to pass this one as well. It's probably too much of a clinical question. I'm not sure if I interpreted it the right way. If, we can take a note and have Olivier answer that question maybe and put him in touch with the person I would suggest that.
Of course. Yes, Tim, thank you for your question. Olivier has had to depart from the webinar now. However, he did discuss cone of uncertainty, and I will put your question to him and get back in touch with you after that. So we have a question from Ashish Shukla. Ashish has asked, are safety parameters also analyzed in value-based pricing? And I would put that one to you, Ed.
I would think it is the same way. I mean, just like in any evaluation under, again, you're going into the cost-effectiveness calculation now, right? So safety aspects will have an impact through, if there are toxicity issues that will lead to additional treatment costs, as well as it will lead to reduced quality of life. So from that perspective, it will absolutely have an impact just as it had before. There's nothing changed here, right? The only thing that's changing here is that the cost-effectiveness cutoff might change depending on the disease area that you have. If your toxicity profile is particularly poor, that I think that will have probably the same kind of impact. The societal factors leading to improvement in disease is not going to change, and the fact that it's not going to be price control versus reimbursement control is not going to change either. So I think it is not going to change the way in which this is analyzed under the value-based pricing system. The outcome will only be different because of the other parameters. And can I actually get back to, if you don't mind, actually I find it important in the question that was asked earlier around adjusting value after launch, continue to developing evidence. And I think it's extremely important that we continue indeed to develop evidence post-launch to help market access discussions. That's obviously very important. I think what is very important too, though, is that you cannot change your price. And that's very unfortunate. It was the change in the UK and in Germany that both decided to control price rather than reimbursement. We can, by better data, argue for better market access, which doesn't have international implications. If you have a poor price at launch or a price reduction later, that's going to cascade to other markets. And that's why we really always have to think of the international implications of what we do. And payers should too.
Thank you very much for that, Ed. And thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'd also like to thank Ed, Ulf, and Olivier for their participation. That's going to be almost about all we've got time for today. I would like to thank all the attendees for their interest throughout the webinar. And I'd also like to take a moment to remind you all of the upcoming Oncology Market Access Europe Conference. This will be our 4th annual event dedicated to bringing pharma a roadmap to oncology access and reimbursement in Europe. Ulf, Olivier, and Ed will all be speaking in more detail on oncology health economics at the event, which will be held on the 20th and 21st of November in Berlin. They'll be joined by a whole host of other speakers from pharma, from payers, and HTAs throughout Europe. As with the webinar, the conference has proved extremely popular, so I urge you all to have a look at the brochure to see whether you would find it valuable. Now, if you look at your chat box, I have just sent you a link to the brochure. If you download that, you'll notice that there is a €300 discount that will expire in 2 weeks' time. So feel free to get in touch with me directly on the details that you will find on that link if you'd like to take advantage of that. I hope to see many of you in Berlin in November. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Ed, thank you, Ulf, and thank you, Olivier, for your participation. And until the next IFA Pharma webinar, goodbye.